Yep, thank you, Pastor A, and it's great to see you all again. So we'll jump in and look at this topic. We've had a good introduction of sort of the relevance of this, how it fits in, and so we're looking at Christianity's impact on the world, the positive or negative effects it's had on society, and so yeah, is that a reason for considering or not? And so just sort of in one slide to sort of say then, what's tonight's argument? It's basically to say that history, the historical record, testifies that although Christians have had shortcomings and things they've done wrong, there are in fact many values that are cherished by the modern world, thank you, which are due to Christianity. And so is that, we'll see in detail then, a positive reason for looking at the good impacts of Christianity. However, and we're actually not focusing so much on this, but this is something to keep in mind for that argument then, is however, as the culture is becoming less Christian, people are actually starting to question whether these really are good values. And so as Christians then, the call would be we always need to live out the truth, which was sort of covered a bit, and now looking more tonight would be the goodness and sort of the beauty of the Christian message of Christ, his life embodied through the church. Yeah, and so we'll see that, and you can see what's the impact of this. Having said that though, yeah, it's not like everyone just loves and say, yeah, Christians have been really great. So there's definitely a different perspective, and there's many things you could look at for this, but one of which would be in the late Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. And sort of my own words, he has sort of four main critiques of religion, and he's thinking of Christianity and Islam in particular when he says sort of religion here, but he basically says religion misrepresents the origins of life and the cosmos, meaning in regards to science, where the universe came from, where life came from, and evolution and stuff like this. He says, you know, Christians get it wrong and confuse people and lead them astray. Two, he says religion, well, he doesn't say this, but I would say that's a summary of his point, is that religion demands unreasonable suppression of human nature, and he's thinking here about sexuality. Christianity's like no fornication, no adultery, wait one partner for life of the opposite gender and stuff like this, and he's saying that is really not how humanity is to express its sexuality. Three, religion inclines people to violence and blind submission. So sadly is one thing, I guess it's September 12th, so this particularly had in mind September 11th in the US, where terrorists hijacked planes and flew them into buildings in the US. It's just saying like, yeah, that's the product of blind religion and faith in this violence and stuff like that. And fourthly, saying religion is hostile to free inquiry, saying, you know, you have to believe the Bible, you're not free to really be open thinkers and have progress and stuff like that. And so you've got to be aware this is the sort of mainstream sort of viewpoint of what they're seeing. And so yeah, is there a response to this? Another figure I'm not sure if you're aware of is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and so she was known as the leading female new atheist in the movement. So she came out of an Islamic background and would say again, you know, religion causes all these problems and stuff like that. And if you've been following the news, last year she has changed her mind. And there have been books sort of written on this whole sort of subject, saying, is there a turning of the tide and stuff like this? And she's someone who would say that, yes, her experience of religion left her with pain, and atheism sort of released from that, but atheism itself was sort of bankrupt and empty and didn't have much to offer, and left her almost like an alcoholic hurt. And then she's embraced Christianity, and so, you know, is there something else to the story? Similarly, also this year, Richard Dawkins on the news, he said this, I do think that we, this is in the UK, I do think that we are culturally a Christian country, and I'd call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, you know, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. So he says more there you can look. But he would still say that, you know, Christianity is false. It's not a true message about God existing and Jesus rising from the dead. But the sort of cultural impact of Christianity is good. And he sort of said this, not me, but so being politically incorrect, he says Islam's on the rise, and he doesn't like that's cultural values and where that's bringing to the UK. And he says there's actually something good about Christianity that's made an impact. And so this is what we'd look at. Just a few sort of 10 or so other people we'll just look at and see what are some of their opinions. And we've got several atheists here, so it's not just sort of Christians saying, of course, Christians are so great. Another, the late atheist Jacques Derrida, said, today the cornerstone of international law is the sacred. What is sacred in humanity? You should not kill, you should not be responsible for a crime against the sacredness. The concept of a crime against humanity is a Christian concept, and I think there'd be no such thing in the law today without the Christian heritage, the Abrahamic heritage, there we go, the biblical heritage. So there you go, so here there's again an atheist saying, no, there's something that Christians have embraced. It is a little bit weird, so a few of these, they would be saying, again, like Richard Dawkins and Jacques Derrida will be saying, I don't accept this, but they are saying that this sort of ideology, this worldview has brought something that has this foundation for that. Another one, again, Luke Ferry, an atheist, says in his brief history of thought, says the Christian idea of human equality was unprecedented at the time and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance. So, overview there, but saying it's made a difference. Tom Holland, and I guess if you're the younger generation, this is not the actor who plays Spider-Man, it's a historian. And he has a book called Dominion, which if you like, it's a great read on the subject. It's quite long, which you can see as a positive if you like, but this is just from a news article that sort of summarizes it. He says here, so his background is as a historian, right? And so he's studying history, and this is sort of what he finds. He says, the longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. It was not just the extreme callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of the sense that the poor and the weak might have any intrinsic value. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in a post-Christian society still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. And so we're going to unpack some of that a bit more and see why would he make that sort of statement. But again, here's an atheist saying, in a sense, atheism or other cultural values, like from the West has a Greco-Roman background, that's not where we're getting our values from. It's something else. It's the Christian foundation. So I think 2 more quotes if you want. Another atheist, Douglas Murray, says, after discarding God, all the work of establishing morals is still before you. It is increasingly clear that contra most atheists, ethics are self-evidently not self-evident. The more atheists think on these things, the more we may have to accept that the concept of the sanctity of human life is a Judeo-Christian notion which might very easily not survive the Judeo-Christian civilization. So again, he's not a Christian, but he's saying there is something that Christianity has brought to society and culture, and it looks as things are fading, that may be going away. And this isn't just sort of our generation, so even previous generations, like at the time he was an agnostic, this is someone who did become a Christian. And here, he wrote here that as he was sort of traveling around the world, so while in India and Africa, he witnessed much righteous endeavor undertaken by Christians of all denominations. However, he added that I never, as it happens, came across hospital or an orphanage run by the Fabian Society or humanist leper colony. I would say there are some as such, but it is, statistically speaking, there are many more Christian organizations doing this work than non-Christian ones as such. And so I think I said 2 more, I just didn't see ahead. If you want another Australian author who has sort of made this point here, Glenn Scribner, he argues that equality, compassion, consent, and enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress are values from the Christian worldview and have become like the air around us, that other cultures did not endorse such things prior to Christianity. So this would be a short read of something like Tom Holland's or even John Dixon's Bullies and Saints as well. That's just making this point that these sort of values that we hold they're so common to us, but yeah, they're not really common. They come from 2,000 years of Christianity. So that's hearing a lot for me from quotes. I'm just going to play a short clip. This is from Sean McDowell, who some of you might be familiar with. If not, you probably have heard of Josh McDowell, his father. And so Sean's gone on to, by and large, follow in his father's footsteps of being a Christian evangelist. He's a teacher at Biola University. He teaches apologetics there and has written lots of great books and stuff like that. And so here's a clip, him sort of saying, has Jesus made the world a better place or not?
We've heard about a lot of bad things, the Crusade and the Inquisition, but has Christianity actually contributed to anything that's good? Well, it might surprise you, Christianity has made remarkable contributions to the good of the world. Consider a few things. Number one, the university. The university is a Christian idea. It actually comes from two words, unity and diversity. The idea was that across a diversity of subjects, there would be the unity of the Christian worldview. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, overseas, the idea of the university was largely founded and begun by Christians, because as Christians we value knowledge and scholarship and learning. Second, hospitals. You ever notice how many hospitals are saint this and saint that? The hospitals really began as a Christian idea to care for the sick and to care for the poor. During the Black Plague, it was a lot of Christians who stayed back to help for the sick, because of our belief that all human beings have value. Orphanages, again, a Christian idea. Why? In ancient Rome at that time, if somebody was a widow, or somebody was an orphan, or a baby that somebody didn't want, they were kind of the dregs of society. They weren't cared for. Christians came along and said, every human being has value. Let's use our resources to care for them. This one might surprise you, but the scientific revolution was largely birthed by Christians because of the Christian worldview, the Judeo-Christian worldview. Pascal, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, on and on, Galileo. People believed the world was orderly, it was rational. We were sanctioned by God to do science because we can care for people and God's creation through science. We have the motivation, a rational, orderly world, we have the worldview and the call to do it. You look at art throughout the history of the world, some of the most beautiful churches, the most beautiful paintings, the most beautiful music has been done by people who believe the world is orderly, but who also believe our music can be a way of worshiping God. So yes, Christians have done some bad things. I will never pretend that hasn't happened. But as we look at a whole at the world, there has never been a greater force for good than Christianity.
Okay, well, we're going to take 3 minutes, and in your groups around your tables or someone next to you, you can discuss what you think so far, but particularly the question I've put forward is, what do you think is the basis for modern Australian values, and does it matter whether or not there is a grounding or sort of foundation for these? So where does Australia get its values from, and what's the source of them? Okay, coming back together, has anyone got any thoughts on that? They wanted to share something said really good in their group, or a further question from that?
This was not my contribution. I agree with it. The idea of the fair go in Australia. Everyone should have a fair go, which I suppose is equal opportunity. Oops. And that came a lot from our history, because we started off as a jail with people coming out who were convicts and who would have been looked down on by the free people and people of a higher social standing. And over the years, that idea of everyone, doesn't matter who you are, you deserve an equal opportunity with anyone else. But basically it does go back to we have equal value in the eyes of God, but I think a lot of people wouldn't recognise that. The other thing is that when there's a disaster or something, now I'm sure it happens in other countries too, but it can be a feature. The whole community gathers round and helps, especially in, say, country areas, but not just country areas. And you read about it, and people say it was wonderful the way people just gathered around them and helped. And that's charity. That's love expressed in practical ways. And that also comes from Christianity. That we help people. We don't abandon them. We don't say, oh, tough luck for you. But I think that comes from Christianity too. But again, I don't know that it would be recognised as such.
Yeah. So there's one behind as well.
In the development of a nation, like the development of a child, the very early years are quite often critical. My sense is that the governors who came to manage this country essentially came from the British upper class, which was a Christian society, a Christian-based society. On the other hand, I've done a bit of looking at genealogy in the last few years. Mine were 4 or 5 generations here from southwest England or from central Germany. And I've been interested in what was their motivation to come to this place. And it appears that it was either health, because half the family had been wiped out by TB before sewage. It was better prospects, or the German mob. They were getting hammered in religious persecution. So that was a pretty strong motivation, and they clearly carried their belief system with them from that basis.
Yep, and I thank you both, and it's great to sort of learn from the wisdom here as well, so they're great comments. Yeah. Maybe just one thing to add. I'm not actually going to touch much tonight on this sort of grounding, this foundation for the values, and I'd agree as what Ms. Marshall said, that they'd probably just say, look, we just give people a fair go, that's it. You don't need anything beyond that. And I would probably point you back to what we covered on the moral argument, to say that no, if, one society says this or one says another, you've either got relativism, and so you need some sort of basis for grounding it. And atheism doesn't provide that foundation. It needs to be grounded in something, and a really good grounding is God as an eternal being, an eternally loving being. Yeah, and so that would be actually a key thing, so we're not focusing on, but I would say, strictly speaking, did cover it, although it was 4 weeks ago sort of thing. Yeah, but we'll move on and we'll see some of the sort of Greco-Roman values, and yeah, there'll be some other comments that do build part of this up a bit. A good book, and it's just the only one I brought tonight. It's more on the 400-page size of it. And we're unpacking just some of the points in this. Is Smith's How Christianity Changed the World. And so we're going to look at the lives changed by Jesus, as well as the value of life, sanctity of life, sexual morality, the value of women, compassion, charity, hospitals, education. I think we're going to skip, the Labour one and touch on science next week. And I'm going to briefly just look at slavery as well. We'll skip sort of art, the sound of music and stuff, but there's many other impacts, but just too many to sort of cover now. And the first one is, I think this is one in terms of, you'd say, well, how has it changed a culture? This isn't like a cultural thing, but in some ways to me this is actually the most important, which is to say there really have been today in the world more than a couple billion lives impacted and changed. And both in the past there's been this, and we can think of people like, some people may say, oh yeah, just Saul, Paul, he's just this Christian guy, but you got to realize how radical he was. He would be something close to a modern day Osama bin Laden. He was the first great persecutor of the church, going around tying up, getting Christians killed. That was him. And to the extent when people heard that he's a Christian, they're like, I don't want to go to meet him. He's the guy who locks people up. And this is not just when Peter said to him, hey, go visit this guy Paul now. This is when God gives you a vision. You're like, no, God, I don't think you quite understand this. And say, lives have been changed, and you could look out throughout history. You could highlight some of the emperors, and it's not that they're more important, but I guess it's to say then that before then they would have been actually persecuting Christianity, and then when they became Christians, it allowed the Christian culture to take its effect more in the laws and stuff like this, to say they were open it, and in a sense in which you would see a bit of how it works. And I want to highlight our people today, and there's so many. On the side I've put the website I Am Second, if you've ever heard of that. It's a US website that has hundreds of video testimonies of generally famous celebrities who have been Christian, and it shows their life. It's got Nick Vujicic at the top, who's actually an Australian, who was born without limbs and may seem without hope, purpose, and his life has changed. If you don't actually know him, I've heard it being said that now that Billy Graham has gone to heaven with Jesus, Nick Vujicic is the person alive who's spoken to more people about Jesus than anyone else in the world today. So it's worth checking out. There's someone like Brian Welch from the band Korn. It's like a heavy metal rock band. I'm actually not particularly sure. I'm going to start incorrectly describing him, but it's had some radical lives, and Jesus turned his life around. And several others. Also, one I've liked is Jim Carrey, like the successful actor, who said something along the lines of, I wish everyone could be rich and famous to realize that that's not the answer. And he's found meaning and purpose in Jesus as well. And sort of sad ones to mention as well, there's been several serial killers who have lived the most horrible lives, and in prison they could have had the option of saying, everything's meaningless, and that was generally what they've said was their sort of motivation for doing this. But they've found healing in Christ. Some people see it as a cop-out. They'd be like, yeah, of course, we had nothing else. But that is really to say the power to change the worst of us, and the power to change us as well. And so, I just wouldn't want to pass on this point. But yeah, that's how Christianity changed the culture, by changing hearts and lives of individual people. Yes.
The Emperor Constantine abolished crucifixion, which would have been radical in Roman culture. It had been there for hundreds of years, and he abolished it.
Yep, well, thank you.
So ISIS kind of...
Can't blame Constantine.
Yep. But I guess that's to say, what is the values that a culture or belief brings and stuff like that. So thank you both. So next one, just to briefly look at, is sort of the sanctity of human life. And sorry, some of these are pretty dark as such, but when someone like historian Tom Holland says, I'm not Greek or Roman in my values, this is what he's sort of looking at. Although I'd also want to say, actually today people say this is sort of where we're headed and this is good, and Christian values are the oppressive ones now. So this is in the discussion. But anyway, we see that sadly infanticide was basically said to be universal amongst the Greeks and Romans. Cicero said he justified infanticide, at least for deformed, pointing to Roman laws, and it states that deformed infants shall be killed. Seneca also said that we drown children who at birth are weakly or abnormal. And it was so common that infanticide had been so common that Polybius blamed the population decline on it, saying that's why we're decreasing in population. And not just to put it on the Greeks and Romans and such, and to say sadly this has actually been a pretty common practice amongst humans no matter where they are, including places like India, China, Japan, North and South America as well. Yep, and there's what sort of the Christian response basically been. We see in the Didache, which is a bit debated in its dating, but normally in the latter parts of the 1st century. Yep, and it states here that you shall not murder a child, whether by abortion or by killing it once it is born. And Christians are generally pointed to places like we've had in a sermon series here at Subi in Genesis 1, saying that all people are made in the image of God, from that they have value and worth. Places like Exodus saying that you shall not murder. And then there's several other passages, one of which being in Exodus 21, 22, that talks about a woman has a miscarriage, and says eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, life for a life, and seems to imply value there. So you have to look up some of these. I'm going to say, so the Christian worldview sort of saw the value of human life, whether from young to that. And then we see then at the time of the Christian emperors, it says before the Edict of Milan in 313, Christian opposition to infanticide obviously was not able to influence the pagan emperors to outlaw it, but only a half century after Christianity attained legal status, Valentinian, a Christian emperor who was sufficiently influenced by Bishop Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia, formally outlawed infanticide in 374. Related to this is, sadly, there's also exposure, the practice of leaving out a child just to die. And then we see the Christian response to this as well, is we see, for instance, Clement of Alexandria, a church father in Egypt in the 2nd century, condemned Romans for saving and protecting young birds or other creatures while lacking the moral compunctions about abandoning their own children. Similarly, the African church father Tertullian, in about 200, strongly denounced this practice. Lactanus, the church father who tutored one of the sons of Constantine the Great, opposed child abandonment, saying, "It is wicked to expose as it is to kill." Yeah, and then we see, so not only then sort of expressing that, and I guess that's to say then they're saying, you know, this is not the way it should be. They didn't have the power to make a law or something against this, but yeah, they're speaking out. We can see the change. And then we said they did do something about it, like adoption. So Callicus of Rome, who died in the year 222, gave refuge to abandoned children by placing them in Christian homes. Or Benias of Dijon, late 2nd century, who, like his spiritual mentor Polycarp, who was martyred, provided protection and nourishment for abandoned children. And so we see this was sort of the Christian response to this. We see, sadly as well, that abortion and matched with unchastity sort of, was common in the Roman Empire, sadly. And the Christian response to this is received, and it's not just the Christian, it's sort of the Judeo-Christian, the Abrahamic religion space there. So Josephus, a Jewish historian, said that according to the biblical law, it forbids women to either cause abortion or to make away with the fetus. Or writing up Paul in Galatians 5:20, it mentions, probably in the NIV, it uses the word sorcery. This is the Greek word pharmakia, which basically means to give potions, I guess in that sorcery kind of sense. And some people say this can include potions to like end a pregnancy and that, and so it's probably implied in that statement there. Or others, such as Tertullian, church father in Northern Africa, stated the Christian position in opposition to abortion by saying that we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb. And he continued saying, nor does it matter whether you take away the life that is born or destroy the one that is coming to birth. So saying, and this, I've generally tried to find an earlier statement, and then you could actually find it in like the 5th and the 6th and 7th, 8th, and 9th century as well. But for our time constraints, I'm saying, you know, right from the beginning, the Christian perspective was, you know, you shouldn't have infanticide, you shouldn't have abortion, you should care in this. And just to say that's the Christian perspective to sanctity of life. You really could do a whole thing on this to say, like, what is the modern day Christian position? And this is where I was saying it's actually sort of weird in that, I don't want to get too political as such, but is to say Christians generally are standing for life, but that's generally not being applauded. That's being like seen as a negative thing today. But yeah, so you actually need to say, well, is that a positive impact of Christianity or not? And it's getting a bit complicated with the cultural values, but in general, I'd say the standing for life is a really great thing. Another one to look at is sexual morality. This is another big one about cultural change. Would actually argue, they might say, actually no, the Roman promiscuity and stuff like this was better. But they have to, I guess with all these then, you sort of have to make up your own mind and see, and then present that and see, like, is that really a world we would want with these things or not? But we see the Roman value was that the undefiled sexual intercourse, along with marital unfaithfulness, had essentially disappeared. Not only were adultery and fornication common, but people engaged in all sorts of sexual methods, many of them obscene. These sexual practices were shamefully illustrated on household items such as oil lamps, bowls, cups, and vases. And the Romans first combined the Greek gymnasium with their public baths, and before this the Romans, unlike the Greeks, did not believe it proper to exercise or bathe publicly in the nude. Yeah, let's see that. Likewise, they had a low view of marriage. It states here that the widespread licentious sex practices threatened the institute of marriage. So Caesar Augustus in 18 BC enacted Lex Julia Adulterus, a law that tried to curb the people's addiction to widespread illicit sex. This law had little effect, however, perhaps because it only punished the married woman in an adulterous act. Roman marriages had greatly deteriorated, and they became loose and involuntary, compact and religious, and civil rights were no longer essential. Another point on this, sort of the low view of marriage, we see in the 2nd century, the Latin orator Juvenal said his society had lost chastity, the goddess, by its widespread addiction to the promiscuous and prudent sex. In Salar 6, he gave themselves, sorry, I just missed a line, how he portrayed the sexually loose morals of women who lecherously gave themselves to gladiators, actors, comedians, and others who were in the public spotlight. Likewise, they point out that sort of the Roman leaders didn't have great values, and in a sense, how could the people be any different if their leaders were known for this? Some of the, it's almost like, why am I not for polite conversation to even read as such? And so then what is sort of the Christian response and the Christian values and perspective is we see things like this, you shall not commit adultery in the law of Moses. In the New Testament, it states that marriage should be held in honor by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and the sexually immoral. Paul states that the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, likewise the wife to her husband. Peter saying, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect. And Jesus saying that when God instituted marriage, well, didn't say this quite because that's rephrased, but it says, Jesus in Matthew basically stated that this institute of marriage was at the time of creation. He told Adam and Eve, the sex act made a husband and wife one flesh, pointing back to Genesis. And to sort of see this is the biblical standard, and in general has been a blessing to sort of the wider world. And more on this, then we see that in the 2nd century, non-Christians said about Christianity that they, Christians, marry as do all. They beget children, they have a common table, they share food together, but not a common bed. So sort of pointing this. So they're saying non-Christians were recognizing this sort of difference. Yep. The early Christians also believed that the sex act was not to be performed openly or graphically portrayed on various household items for others to see, as the Romans did. Instead, sex was seen as a gift of God. There was also Christianity that brought sort of more human rights in this area. So the wife in the 5th century was able to divorce her adulterous husband, something that never occurred before in the ancient world. Edward Reskimak, the renowned scholar of history of marriage, says that a woman being able to divorce her husband on the grounds of adultery or sodomy is an innovation that reveals the influence of Christian ideals. Yes, that's in terms of sexual morality. Again, just some of that. Maybe I could probably pause at the last one as well, but any further comments or questions about that, how it's impacted the sanctity of life or sexuality? Yes, Peter, so I think the mic's coming around. Oh, yeah. We'll go here first and we'll go here next.
My voice is not loud enough. Secular people, non-Christian people, would argue that, well, is there any evidence to show that if a society ignores Judeo-Christian values, like the ones that you've talked about, marriage, not aborting children, all those sorts of things, if the society doesn't follow those and does whatever it wants, is there any evidence to show that there are negative impacts to that society or to that community or that group that has decided to ignore all the things that you talked about here? Can they be shown that, no, look, if you go this way, bad things will happen? Is there any evidence to show that?
Yep. Yeah. In terms of this overall topic, I would consider this the sort of expertise of a church history major, which is not my field as such. And your particular question would be to me, a sociologist. And I would want to say yes, there definitely is. But the truth is, I'm speaking just off the cuff, so I can't point you to direct sources as such. But I would think even in Perth, I know someone like Bruce Robinson, who's in charge of the Fathering Project, and will say the impact of active fathers in the life of kids and a family makes a world of difference. And that would be connected to all these sort of factors as well, about sexual morality, about, you know, the husband's right to only divorce the wife, but Christianity bringing it to both and creating sort of equality in the marriage and that thing. And so, yes, I would say there's been lots of studies, but I can't actually point to, I know the study by this person and that does that. I don't know if anyone else can add to it.
Come to Steve next.
Thanks. Just a point of clarification, in page 37, it states that there is still another Roman motive, one unusual one for aborting pregnancy, and namely desire to be childless.
Yeah.
I want to ask this question about childlessness. Is there something wrong with that? You know, or what's the difference between childlessness and singlehood, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and so I skipped over that one for sort of time-wise. And I would think Paul, Jesus himself was single. Paul upholds it in 1 Corinthians 7 as a good value, saying you're freed, being single, to serve Christ, the church and his people all the time. Was married people are distracted, doesn't use the word distracted, but yeah, have other occupations, priorities. Thank you. Yeah. But yeah, in terms of the childness in this Greco-Roman society, what's been highlighted here was to say that there was prestige in being single because a young aspiring figure may say, hey, this single old person can give me honor, prestige, inheritance and wealth and this. So in a sense, they could pretend to be childless to gain that prestige. That is what it's getting at here. And likewise then, that's to say it's a reason why people would have had exposure, abortion, infanticide and stuff like this, saying we don't actually want the children because it can increase our social status by having that. So that's what it's talking about. And so that would not be a Christian perspective, which sees children as a blessing from the Lord, caring for life and stuff like that. That's what that one's getting at. Does that help or any further?
So you're saying that voluntary childlessness by a married couple is not acceptable?
Yeah, so I don't think this particular point is talking about it. Because
it's an extension.
Yeah, it's just generally looking to say the Greco-Roman culture didn't value children in multiple ways, whether it's infanticide, exposure, abortion, and even just being childless because of the prestige you would offer sort of added to this whole picture. But yeah, so not really, and then I'd say the Christian view in general sort of value this, but I don't think it states that, you must have children or that. I would say a general Christian theology on marriage would see it as a gift from the Lord, that sadly in a fallen world, some people are not able to have, and so that's definitely not to be looked down upon. But politely speaking, I do tend to think, and I could be wrong on this, but I do tend to think that if it was a healthy Christian couple that didn't have any reason, if they did want to free themselves to serve, I think that would be good. But if they wanted to avoid children, I'd need to know the further reasons why, but that would seem unusual from a Christian perspective. Yeah.
I was just going to add a quick comment in that, I guess there are some concerns about whether our culture has rejected a lot of these values. But as someone who goes to a university, which I think most people see as kind of the more progressive end, I guess that these people still actually really wholeheartedly accept at least some of those values still. So for instance, consent is something that they're very keen on messaging about, and I won't have any quotes or anything, because some of them are just totally horrendous, but that wasn't something that like the ancient world thought was they were super keen on. So.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yes, that's a good point. And this is a broader picture of how it's changed the world, and I'm just highlighting one or two things, so much more could be said on each of these. So yeah, thank you.
As an early childhood teacher over many years, a long time ago when I first started, lots of kids had dads and they had mums, and the kids did quite well, but now the mums are working, the dads are working, and there's very little time for the children, very little space for them to play, and the children are often left to their own devices. And what they're finding now is that in schools they're trying to train male early childhood teachers and bring them into childcare because the children have no exposure to men. And children, little boys, are not little girls, and they need a dad, because it's fine to have the mum for the first few years of life, but by age 6, the boy needs the guidance of a father, because the father is the one who teaches him how to be a man, and the father teaches the girl what she should expect from a future husband. And so there's big problems in the whole education system now, because children just don't have access to men, and they need it.
Yep, no, thank you for that wise comment. There's some good thoughts there. We'll move on and see if you've got some further things that come up from this. So another area is the place of women, and we see that in general the Greco-Roman view didn't have much regard for them, and Christianity sort of gives them freedom and dignity. So a few quotes on this. We see, sadly, it was said that a respectable Athenian woman was not permitted to leave a house unless she was accompanied by a trustworthy male escort, which was commonly a slave who was appointed by the husband. And when the husband's male guests were present in his home, she was not permitted to eat or interact with them. She had to retire to the women's quarters. And the only woman who had freedom was the mistress, who often accompanied a married man when he attended events outside his home. And this, the mistress is saying, was the sexual partner of the husband, which is to say that whole fornication, chastity, covered brief before, sexual morality was low. Another thing we see on the values of women in Greco-Roman society was that Greek discrimination against women began early in a woman's life cycle. Non-slave boys in Athens were sent to school, taught to read and write, and educated in poetry, music, gymnastics. Girls did not go to school at all, says one Greek scholar. Throughout a woman's entire life, silence was an adornment to women. Euripides asserted silence and discretion are the most beautiful in women, and remaining quiet within the house. And the philosopher Aristotle said, silence gives grace to woman. But long before the days of Euripides, Sophocles, and Aristophanes, the writer Homer portrayed Telemachus rebuking his mother Penelope for speaking in the presence of a man. Dogmatically tells her that speech shall be for men. Another one on this, Euripides has Hippolytus ask, why hast thou given a home beneath the sun, Zeus, unto woman, a specious curse to man? Or Aleucus has, thank you, as the chorus declare, evil of mind are they women, they are guiltful of purpose with impure hearts. Another Greek poet, Aristophanes, has the chorus in his play Lyestra say, for women are shameless set of the vilest creatures going. The great, in Homer the epic says, Megnon declares, one cannot trust women. And of course you have the Greek myth of Pandora's box, or jar, that blamed women for introducing evil into the world. And I guess, you have to ask, is this a full historical picture, which say, you could get, sadly, sexist comments here and there, but let's say people who have looked at this would say, no, this is representative, and this is saying that they had a low view. And sort of one last one on this, we found like a letter of a soldier who was out in the field, writing back to his pregnant wife, and he said, she's about to give birth, and it says, if the infant is born, if it's a male, let it live, but it's a female, cast it out. So yes, this is sort of sad to see, and then so we see sort of the Christian response to this is that you can say it didn't necessarily lead a total sort of revolution, but we can see some of this impact. So he writes here, lest one reads conclude that Jesus started a women's movement, it needs to be said that he did not. Christ came to change the hearts and minds of people rather than to implement social or political movements. It is giving women respect and status equal to men meant that he not only broke with the anti-female culture of his era, but he set a standard for his followers to emulate. In the 2nd century then, we see sort of in the Christian pagan dialogue, we see Celsus, the 2nd century critic of Christianity, ridiculed Christians because they were saying that it was only women who were attracted to this, which is sort of like them having this low view of women, saying only someone would be dumb enough to follow this like this. But Christians would say no, that's saying they appeal to the value, the worth, and the dignity of women and all they can bring to that. And so there's so much more that could be said there, but that's just all I was going to highlight there. It's again, so when someone like Tom Holland says, in my values today in the 21st century, I'm not Greek or Roman, he's saying, because yes, they had this disregard for the weak, the poor, for women and stuff like this, and he's saying that's not my values, and it's Christianity that has brought this. Anyone want to add or comments on that, the place of women and how Christianity has sort of uplifted and upheld that? Yes.
Well, it's just before Christianity came into being, during Jesus' ministry, and there was a woman caught in adultery. And even though the male and the female committed adultery, it was the woman who was brought before Jesus, and his response to those who accused the woman, he just wrote in the sand and then said, he who cast the first stone, what are you going to do about it? And that was a really clever answer, and all of the Jewish leaders went away. And then the other thing that's really interesting is the way that Jesus included the women, like Mary Magdalene, who put oil all over Jesus' head and his feet, and she wiped his feet with her hair, and he allowed that intimacy with women, which was very shocking in those days. And she was the first one to see Jesus once he had risen from the dead. So Christianity included women in a way they had never been included before. And the rules about marriage for women under Christianity were very radical. If we read what Scripture says about them in the New Testament, they're very radical and had never been seen before.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a good point. Move on, the next one to look at, sort of 20 so minutes left, hopefully. There's charity and compassion. And we sort of look again at the Greco-Roman value of the poor. And so it's this, that the early Christians practiced caritas as opposed to liberalitas of the Romans. Caritas meant to relieve the recipient's economic or physical distress without expecting anything in return, whereas liberalitas meant to please the recipient who would later bestow a favour for the gift. So it's sort of like giving with the expectation that now you have to reciprocate and give in return. So according to the Roman culture of that era, such behaviour defiled common sense. It was seen as a sign of weakness and was viewed with suspicion. There was nothing to be gained by expending time and energy, even involuntary, with people who could not contribute to the Roman valour and to the strength of the state. The prevalence of Stoic philosophy made it disrespectful to associate with the weak, the poor, and the downtrodden. Yeah, so, how different we see Jesus, a friend of sinners, like this, and it's to say there's, it's, not just like survival of the fittest, there's like love and care for people who are made in God's image and value. So here's another sort of point on this, is but why would that help, is to say the Romans' habit of selling young children, the innumerable exposures, the readiness of the poor to enroll themselves as gladiators, the frequent famines show how large was the measure of the unrivaled distress of the time. This also helps to recall the observation of La Materia, a historian of ancient society, that before Christianity arrived, some pagans did perform some isolated humanitarian acts. However, such behaviour was not motivated by pagan cultural values or religion, but rather was an exception to them on the part of some individuals. As he expressed it, pagans had a morality, but not but paganism had none. So yeah, this is not to say then that, yeah, the claim isn't that, you know, all people from the Greek and Roman culture were just horrible and bad. Let's say, yeah, there were people who did good things, but the sort of the values of that culture and that was not good. And in contrast, then we're seeing how Christianity has changed things. A few other examples of this. Plato said that a poor man, usually a slave, was no longer able to work because of sickness, should be just left to die. Even Pelagius, the famous Greek physician, he praised him for not prescribing medicine to those who knew were preoccupied with their illness by saying if they're going to die, don't waste medicine on them. The Roman philosopher Plautus argued, you do a beggar a bad service by giving him food and drink. You lose what you give and prolong his life for more misery. The Romans, at the time of a plague, the Romans panicked and fled from a contagious plague in Alexandria during the 4th century, leaving behind their friends and next of kin, and such behaviour prompted the Emperor Julian, the apostate, who reigned in the 4th century, to lament that the Christians, whom he detested, loved to show compassion, whereas the pagan countrymen did not. He said, the impious Gallians, Christians, relieved both their own poor and ours, and it continued that it is shameful that ours should be so destitute of our assistance. And I think I've heard John Dixon talk about this. He adds that he started, the Emperor Julian started a program, but nothing really happened. It seemed like the funds got embezzled, and so it never ended up making any effect on this. So then what's sort of the Christian response? If the Greco-Roman culture is saying, you know, don't waste time and money on the weak, the poor, the needy and stuff like this, the Christian response has been that, however, an individual, regardless of his social or economic status, was valuable because he possessed a soul redeemed by Jesus Christ, saved in the made in the image of God, and not only that, Christ has died for them as well. And a point here then is that when modern sort of secularists show compassion today, upon seeing or hearing some human tragedy, for example, massive starvation, earthquake disasters, mass murders, they show that they have unknowingly internalized Christianity's concept of compassion. So that be his argument, and this next point is making that same thing. So a Christian Josiah Stump from roughly 100 years ago said that Christian ideals have permeated society until non-Christians who claim to live a decent life without religion have forgotten the origin of the very content and context of their decency. I think that was kind of the point that Jenny made earlier, and that's the kind of thing that I think Tom Holland is getting at as well, is to say that yes, like people may have this, but can you actually detach it from there? What's the grounding, what's the basis from that? And it seems it's Christianity that's giving this love and compassion, this care for the poor and needy. I don't know if there's any comments on that, but if not related to this, just look at healthcare briefly and see what sort of was the Greco-Roman standards and what did Christianity bring, how has it changed the world in this regard. Yep. So see sort of the pagan healthcare system. Dionysius, a Christian bishop of the 3rd century, described the existing behaviour of the pagans toward their fellow sick human beings in an Alexandrian plague in about 250 AD. For the pagans, he said, thrust aside anyone who began to be sick and kept aloof even from their dearest friends, who cast the sufferers out upon the public roads half dead and left them unburied, and treated them with utter contempt when they died. So when epidemics broke out, says Howard Haggard, the Romans often fled in fear and left the sick to die without care. He further notes that the Romans, we've already covered this, but saw helping a sick person as a sign of human weakness. So that's their sort of perspective, and this is the Christian side. But it first sort of points that it says that, well, wasn't there some Greco-Roman healthcare first? And so it says, yep, there's a modicum of truth to the belief that the Greeks and Romans had some form of hospital before the Christians introduced them. But these were not places for the sick in general, or public work cared for a charity. They were at best places for treating soldiers. Yeah, which is to say only certain people with certain abilities in this would be cared for, not everyone. So yeah, Christian hospitals for the poor and the indigent public did not exist yet until Christianity introduced them. And that's sort of what we see. So I also want to point out then that for the first 300 or so years, if the Christians weren't in power, they didn't necessarily have the funds, ability, or the sort of safety to make these big projects. So during the first 300 centuries of Christianity's existence, when its members were subject to frequent and severe persecutions, the most that Christians could do was to care for the sick when they found them, and in many instances by taking them into their own homes. But after the Edict of Milan in 313, and especially after Constantine defeated his co-emperor Licinius in the east in 324, Christians were able to direct more attention and energy towards providing care for the sick and dying. Hence the first ecumenical council of the Christian church at Nicaea in 325 directed bishops to establish a hospice in every city that had a cathedral, so like a sufficiently large thing that was to be part of this service and care. And so we sort of see this is where the roots from. So it changed from, yes, there was healthcare and that, but it was limited to some to, yeah, it's becoming widespread, public and available, and it sort of spreads out. And that's something I still technically feel is around in Western society today. So we have, I can't even think of them all, but you know, St. John of God Hospital, probably help me, there's Charles Garden. That's it. No.
What's the name?
Yeah. But there's still sort of remnants of that to say, like, yes, we can see that they've made an impact on that today. Since that, in terms of education then, so we see what difference has Christianity made. This is just sort of jumping, not looking at what's the Greco-Roman picture first, but just saying the Christian perspective has been that obedient to Christ's command that the disciples and all Christians were to teach people all things, sort of in the Great Commission, teach them to obey all things that I've commanded them. Newcomers to the church were instructed in catechumens, that is, they were taught orally by the question and answer method in preparation for baptism and church membership. Both men and women were catechized, often over a period of 2 to 3 years. At first, individuals were often instructed in the teacher's home. Catechetical instruction led to formal catechetical schools with a strong literary emphasis. Thus, by about 150 AD, Justin Martyr, often called the first great scholar of Christian church, established such catechetical schools, one in Ephesus and one in Rome, and soon these schools appeared in other regions. So although the teaching of Christian doctrine was the primary focus of these schools, some, such as the schools in Alexandria, also taught mathematics and medicine. And then sort of like the next generation is like when Origen succeeded Clement of Alexandria, he added a grammar to the curriculum as well. So we're seeing this sort of growing that. They were to teach all that Christ obeyed, and it became not only teaching the Christian good news and scriptures, but like larger learning as well. Yep, sorry, so another point is to see that not only then, we did see previously the Greco-Romans only were taught the boys and only free boys, not slave boys. And so we see here that Christianity had education for both sexes. So although there was no unanimity amongst historians, many indicate that the Romans before the birth of Christ did not formally educate girls in literary schools. The schools, says one education historian, apparently only taught boys, and then only boys in a privileged class, and then gymnasia, while girls were excluded. Whereas Christianity's aim was universal education, not confined to the rich among the Greeks and Romans, and it made no distinction of sex. If we're sort of jumping forward, like about the year 1500, you might say, well, where does these sort of public schools that are free public schools paid by the government sort of come from? And this basically comes from Martin Luther, the reformer. You see here that public schools are common, widespread phenomenon today. As best as can be determined, this concept first came from the mind of Martin Luther, Before this time, education, especially on the elementary level, was supported and operated by the church in cathedral and episcopal schools, along with monasteries and nunneries. Luther had lost faith in those schools, obviously with the Catholic Protestant issues, and with good reason. Most people were illiterate, and he knew that most boys and girls readily received no education when they stayed home. Most parents evidently were incapable of teaching, and others lacked interest. The lack of education, he believed, would eventually spell doom for the church and society. If the civic authorities could spend money on military arms, bridges, roads, dams, and so forth, then why could they not also spend money to educate the youth? In short, the country needed public schools supported by funding from the public treasury. So saying that appears to be the origin of the public funded school system. I actually think this book is from the US, and I think now sometimes an emphasis that I hear, not completely, but some Christians saying the homeschooling is better quality than the public. That's another issue, to say there can be some benefit from this as well. Any comments on some of that? Some things, sorry, I probably haven't stopped for a while, but just to highlight things like healthcare and hospitals, the education and that. We'll go on to a few more points before we finish up, but yep. I guess.
What surprised me was the way that things spread. I mean, the hospitals, as soon as they had the power, they said a hospital in every town that has a cathedral. Instead of just a hospital here and a hospital there. That was amazing, that it became so widespread so quickly as soon as they had the power to do it. And the same with the education of the girls and the boys. The way 150 AD, they were educating girls and boys, men and women. The way that it was widespread, it wasn't just in isolated pockets or amongst in isolated geniuses about it. It was part of the ethos.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. I guess, sorry, at the back.
The thing about education and slavery is that William Wilberforce and the British Parliament, he was actually really influential, so he was able to combine with the British Parliament, and they got slavery abolished. And the other thing they did, the children would work as chimney sweeps, and they'd work in really, really terrible conditions from almost as soon as they could walk, and they were doing jobs that they shouldn't have been doing, and being chimney sweeps. And so what the Christians did was start up schools so that it was mandatory that children actually had to go to school, and they didn't have to work 12-hour days when they were 5 years old. And so that was revolutionary at the time, and education's kept going from there.
Yep, no, thank you. Yes, good point. Yeah, related to that one, that is, yeah, one thing that could be said about workers' rights. We've actually covered some of this in the sermons, so just to sort of recap things you've heard is basically to say the Greco-Roman viewpoint saw that physical labour was bad. It was for slaves, not for free people. Yeah, but on the flip side then is sort of Christians would have like Jesus as an example, who's said to be carpenter's son, and had that. Also had someone like Paul, who was a tent maker, and Paul said things like, if a man will not work, he should not eat. And just to say they saw value in that. There's so much more that could be said, but that was the sort of only two slides I wanted to highlight there. And I know people have said like Protestant work ethic as well, about like, it's not just a divide of there's secular work and sacred work, but all things can be done to the glory of God, could be said. And the last few is like, on science, which we'll cover more next week as such, but we'll be looking more at what is science. So just in terms of where science sort of has background, this is just one slide on it. It says here that belief in the rationality of God not only led to the inductive method, but also led to the conclusion that the universe is governed rationally by discoverable laws. Another prominent presupposition of Christianity is that God, who created the world, is separate and distinct from it. Aristotelian philosophy, on the other hand, saw God and the gods in Aristotle's pagan thinking and the universe of nature intertwined. This posits a pantheistic, pananimationist conception of the world. Planets, for example, were seen as having an inner intelligence, like an anima that animated them, that induced them to move. This pantheistic view of planetary movement was first challenged by a Christian in the 1300s at the University of Paris. And it said that, it's in the beginning that God created these things. They are not sort of gods and pantheistic entities themselves, but that, and it's saying that sort of opens up science. If you think there's a scientific knowledge, law, reason behind lightning, not the god Thor or something like that. And I think this is the last one we just want to look at. And that's just to say slavery, which we've already had. I think that's an artistic drawing of William Wilberforce making that. And this is to say, sadly, that slavery was common, not just to sort of Europe. In fact, it says it predates in African and Arabic countries. And not to excuse this is a huge topic in and of itself, but is to say it was a Greco-Roman thing as well as what the other populations had it as well. And then sadly, this is something that is still around today. This book, which is the main source of this information, is about 20 years ago, but I did check, it's still the case that the same sort of ministry is highlighting slavery in Sudan and trying to do work to end it there. And one thing it highlights as well, that slavery wasn't just a white thing. There were, even in the US, in the order, this is one particular place to that, but there were also blacks who kept slaves. But the point would be, is what then was the Christian response to it? And like St. Paul in Philemon says, for the sort of Philemon, the runaway slave, that you get him back no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. And this point about how was made earlier, so Jesus didn't come to bring a woman's movement, but had sort of values that changed individuals that would lead to this. That could be argued for this sort of same thing here as well. The way that Paul looks at Onesimus, sorry I said Philemon before, didn't I? But says that it's a different perspective on it, and then it's worked itself out in the life of someone like William Wilberforce. That was the last thing I wanted to do. I think for time-wise, I'm just tossing whether we want this 3-minute discussion. It's kind of like a recap. I guess I was trying to aim for 75 minutes. I think I went over by a couple minutes, but we've still got 15 or so minutes. And maybe rather than hearing from me, you can hear from the others around the table and discuss this. This is sort of a reflection then of what we've looked at, to say then, is this then the impact of Christianity? Is this a good thing overall? And so is it a reason why someone should consider Christ, should consider Christianity? Or what about, and we haven't covered this, but this is basically the other response is, well, aren't there other good people, atheists, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, and other things? So wouldn't that be a good reason to accept their faith too? So maybe you can discuss in your tables around next to you whether you think Christianity has had a good impact, it's worth considering, or whether you can get these values and foundations from elsewhere.
Okay, let's come back together.
Thank you.
Hope you had a good discussion around some of these questions. I'm going to give David Gregg a bit of a voice break because he's been saying a lot of hard names that I don't think many of us could have done a much better job than that. I was sitting there thinking, I'm glad it's not me trying to read these quotes and these names. Actually, Dave, can we go back to the previous slides so let me just see the questions? So we had a couple of questions. So is the impact of Christianity a good reason for someone to consider Christ? That's a good question. What about good people from other religions? Is that a good reason to consider those faiths? So 2 questions. Would anyone like to have an answer or to share an answer to one of these questions? Maybe we have someone who hasn't shared first. Yeah. Steve, do you want to say something? Other people? Yeah. Any comments? Surely I've been hearing some really good discussions around the tables. I'm pretty sure that table at the back was having a big discussion. Okay, all right, Steve, you kick us off.
First question, right? I think most of us are aware of what changed life can affect other people. Before this talk, I only know about personal testimony. I just heard from someone in church the other day, someone I never met before. He says the reason he became faith because his colleague's life is totally changed.
Yes.
That's how he got attracted. Why is this one different? But after tonight's talk, I can tell people that there are more evidence that Christian not only affect the personal level, but the society, even the country. So I think there's a good thing to do. Right?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's a great comment. Yep. Now, I was going to come to someone at that back table. Does someone there want to share? Yeah, thanks, Tony.
That comment works in the reverse as well. To the point of their death, my parents both rejected Christianity with vehemence on the basis they'd seen too many hypocritical Christians in their life.